Amen. Thank you. Our scripture reading this morning comes from Mark chapter 10, verses 46 through 52. And the scripture reads, As Jesus and his disciples came to Jericho, with his disciples, a large crowd was leaving the city. Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting on the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out, saying, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. And many sternly ordered him to be quiet. But he cried out even more loudly, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus stopped and stood still and said, Call him here. And they called the blind man, saying to him, Take heart, get up, he is calling to you. So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up, and he came to Jesus. And then Jesus said to him, What do you want me to do for you? The blind man said to him, My teacher, let me see again. And Jesus said, Go, your faith has made you well. And immediately he regained his sight and followed him along the way. May God add his blessing to the reading of his word. I was the other day flipping through the channels and came upon one of my favorite movies, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And I don't know how many of y'all are acquainted with this. It is an old movie. It came out when I was about 15 or 16 years old, and I'm delighted now that my 15-year-old daughter loves this movie. It's one of her favorite movies now. And I brought it to mind because there was the scene in the movie where the characters visit the Museum of Art in Chicago, and they stand there in front of one of the most famous paintings that we have here in our country. It's certainly the most famous painting there at the Chicago Museum of Art. It's called Le Grand Jatte, and it's a painting painted over 100 years ago of a beautiful park scene where everybody is sitting or standing. There's a woman there reading a book, and there are people standing and strolling. There's some people playing with boats along the river. It's a beautiful painting. And in the movie Ferris Bueller, one of the characters is staring at the painting, and they do something really interesting. They show one of the people depicted in the painting, a little girl, and the director of the film does a close-up and gets closer and closer and closer and closer on this little girl. And finally, as you close in and as you get just on her face, you see that her face, it has no lines. It's all dots. The face of the little girl is just made up of probably 50 or 60 little dots. Her body is made up of another couple of hundred. Then you back out and you realize this entire picture, there is not one single stroke. There is not one single line. The whole painting is made up of hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of tiny little dots. Just like the pictures we take with our iPhones today. You zoom in far enough on those pictures and you can see the little dots, the pixels that are there. And as you back off, you see how little dots and little pixels can make such a beautiful and sharp and vivid picture. Well, the artist that drew this painting, that dotted this painting, he said that this is what life is like. Life is like a series of little incidents. And all of them taken together depict our lives. That's what we think of as life, or even as we're thinking about other people. For instance, how do we get to know those around us? How do we get to know our neighbor that sits next to us here in church, or our neighbor at home? Well, we get to know them through many, many little incidents, little encounters that we have with them along the way. And none of those individual encounters tells us a great deal. But all taken together, over years and years, we can learn so much about a person and learn just what kind of person someone is. We are blessed today to have that ability, even though we cannot interact with Jesus the way Bartimaeus did in our scripture reading for today, even though we cannot see him and cannot follow him in a literal sense. We can't be a part of those encounters. We can read about them. And we can put ourselves into those encounters. And we can learn so much about Jesus by looking at all of these interruptions, encounters he had along the way. They can tell us about Jesus, but then they can also tell us about our own lives. And they can tell us about our ability to have an effect on others as we encounter others along our way, as we surely do every day and every week, encountering new people all around us. So what do we learn from these encounters of Jesus? What little dots can be added to the picture that we know about him? Excuse me. One thing we learn is that Jesus encounters along the way. When he touches people's lives and he heals people, even when he tells stories sometimes, when he tells his parables, when he gives instructions, so often these are interruptions in his life. And Jesus is always, that we read about, willing to stop. He's willing to allow these interruptions to occur in his life. The woman touches the hem of Jesus' garment and he stops. The 10 lepers come past Jesus and Jesus sees them and he stops. Blind Bartimaeus calls out, "Son of David, have mercy on me," and Jesus stops. The woman puts a coin into the collection box and Jesus stops. You read through the Gospels and suddenly you realize how many of these stories that we tell over and over again and talk about repeatedly are actually moments where Jesus is being interrupted. Interrupted along the way, and Jesus stops. Now, we have a very hard time with interruptions nowadays. Maybe it's just me. I like to read a lot of books and articles about productivity. And if you read about how you're supposed to be, how you can be productive in your job, well, one of the main things they tell you is to limit interruptions. That interruptions are the worst thing for you, especially when you're doing something creative. If you're sitting there writing and you're in the flow of writing or doing something like that, really anything, and someone interrupts you, they say it can take 15 minutes to get back to where you were before. So one little interruption, 15 minutes to get all the way back again. And this is becomes so significant, and because it costs money, money, then we're going to pay attention to it. And so there's a whole part of science called now interruption science. And it's all about the effects of interruptions on productivity. Interruptions have a bad name today, and we know this. We feel it in our lives because we know how much of our time gets taken away because of interruptions. I think it's one reason that Jesus set the story of the Good Samaritan. He set it on on a busy road. Now remember, this is the story of the Good Samaritan. Jesus made this story up, so he put it on the road between Jerusalem and Jericho, which was a hugely busy road. And there were people on their way, getting from Jerusalem. I mean, you had to walk to get from Jerusalem to Jericho in a day. It was a good day's walk. You had to have a good clip going, and you couldn't stop or you wouldn't make it to that town by the end of the day. And so there it is, this idea of interruptions, and who's willing to be interrupted? Who's willing to stop along the way? And here is Jesus throughout his ministry. And again, you read the gospel. Pick one of the gospels and read it and see, just keep count how many times Jesus is interrupted. And that's why he heals. And that's why he teaches. And that's why he forgives, because somebody has interrupted it and because he has been willing to stop. To stop. And there's a word for us today, because so many of us today travel through life with strong motors and weak brakes. I mean, we're chugging along at full speed, and how hard it is, how difficult it is to stop along the way. Well, maybe Jesus realized and knew the limit of time. And that this moment, and here's something we so often forget, these moments that come along where we have the opportunity to stop for a moment, to encounter somebody, to have a real conversation, some of those moments will never, ever come again. We'll never have the chance again to minister to somebody in this particular way. If we say no, if we say we can't do it right now, if we say we're too busy, then the chances are that moment will never come again. And that opportunity to be of help to someone may never come again. It was now or never, Jesus knew. And he made a point then of stopping along the way. And we need that word today more than ever, because we have a hard time stopping. So take this and apply it to the part of your life where it is most needed. But I'll tell you what I think. I think as we progress throughout this week, as we think about this coming week, the next week, the week after, to work to make sure our agendas are never so firmly set that there's not a room to stop and to have a real conversation and to be of help to someone when it's inconvenient for us, but it is convenient for them, or it's possible for them. Here's a lesson we can take away from the life of Jesus: this willingness to stop. That's pretty easy, pretty simple. But Jesus also shows something else in these encounters along the way. He shows his ability not only to stop, but to really see. I mean, it's one thing to stop and to have a conversation or to hear what somebody's up to or to hear what their needs are, what they need from you. That's one thing. But to really open your ears, to listen to them and to see the needs that they have. Not only needs. I mean, Jesus saw the needs, certainly, but he also saw the potential in people. I mean, I guess I'm saying that when Jesus encountered somebody, he really saw them. He didn't take them for granted. When he saw Peter, you know, Peter was a big breast fisherman. And Jesus saw who he really was, who he had the potential to be, the rock on whom the church was built. Other people looked at Matthew and saw a tax collector and a traitor. And Jesus looked at him and saw a disciple, an apostle, the writer of a gospel. Jesus always saw the potential in people because he wasn't taking them for granted. He wasn't just seeing what the outside. He was looking inside, the potential and at the needs as well. He didn't forget about, Jesus didn't forget or didn't try not to see, as sometimes we do, the pain and the promise. Pain and the promise. It's so easy for us to see folks around us and to take them for granted. And yes, with the strangers, certainly. It's easy to lump all strangers into one category and to say, no, we're not going to deal with them, and we take them for granted. But think, too, about how the people we have the greatest opportunity to take for granted are the ones that are closest to us, the ones that mean the most to us, the ones we see the most often in life, our friends, our families, our co-workers. How easy it is to take them for granted and not to see them, not to realize that this time that we are spending with them is slipping through our fingers like sand. And soon it will be gone. I can't help but think this about where I am right now, and Leslie as well, as parents. We have been parents for 15 and a half years, and it's so easy to believe it's going to go on forever. Because in some ways it feels like it has been forever that we have been parents. 15 and a half years, and just when we get one thing mastered and figured out, on we go to the next phase of the childhood. 15 and a half years these kids have been around, taking up the free moments of our lives. And boy, it's easy to take them for granted and to think they're always going to be there. But they're not. 7 years from now, we've been at it 15 and a half years, 2/3 of the way through this part of our being parents. 7 years from now, we'll be taking Will off to college. And we'll still be their parents, and they'll still be our children, and everything will be different. How easy it is right now to take those kids for granted and to think they're always going to be right down the hall. Always going to be there in the morning when we wake up. It's true of our children. It's also true of our grandparents and our parents. It's true of our friends. It's true of the friends we see every day. It's true of the friends we never get to see. They're off in some other place, and we take for granted that they're always going to be there. But they're not. Jesus had a way not only of stopping along the way, but opening his eyes to the people and seeing what blessings each one was as a child of God. He saw people, Jesus did, and he didn't take anyone for granted. So there's another idea for us. as we go through our week, to be able to be willing to stop for those that we love, to be willing to look at them and to see them and to not take them for granted, and to be able to look at them too and be able to see what needs they have and how we can address them. And then there's one other thing that we can do as well. We can stop, yes, and we can see them and not take those for granted, whether they're strangers or family. But we can also be like Jesus in that Jesus' encounters were so consistent with who he was. Jesus had the person that he was. He had the words that he spoke, and he had the actions that he did. And Jesus was unique, or I believe, and most Christians do believe, Jesus was unique in this world, and that all three of those circles were perfectly aligned. Jesus acted the way he spoke. Jesus spoke the way he was in his heart, his very best self. And that's something we can reach for as we encounter others along the way, to reach for being our very best selves when we encounter them. And when Jesus talked to us, he did so often about money. Talked about what we should do with our money. Here we have it. We have this surplus. We have more money than we need. We've paid all our bills. And here's this extra money. And here Jesus is saying, do not store up for yourself treasures on earth where moth and rust consume and thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourself treasures in heaven. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. And those were the words and words like them that Jesus said about wealth and about money. And then along comes, after saying these words, along comes this rich, young, perhaps a little bit foolish, a little bit naive man. And he said, Jesus, I'll do anything. I want to inherit the kingdom of God. What is it that I can do? And how easy it would have been for Jesus to say, well, take 10% of that money and give it to me, or give it to one of my disciples. And how much easier that would have made his life, Jesus, and the disciples' lives, all those who followed him. You know, Jesus' actions were consistent with his words. And he told that young man, go off and sell everything. Get poor. Get so you don't have anything at all. And then come back and see me, and I'll take care of you. His words were consistent with what he believed in his heart, and his actions were consistent with his words. You know, that's what I think we often have, these two selves. Actually, it says two selves, the selves that we are. Now, these are the selves we really are, friends. Down deep, all masks torn away, all love, everything gone, right? The true selves. And then we have the selves that we aspire to be, perhaps like Christ. And it's when those two things come together, the selves we are and the selves we aspire to be, that we want to be. That's when we are Christ-like, because that's who Christ was. That's actually the meaning of the word integrity. It is oneness. Those two circles of life coming together. Who we wish we are, who we want to be, and who we really are. Well, Jesus was like this. His teachings were consistent with his actions, which were consistent with who he was every day. And that's how he encountered others. And imagine that. Imagine as we go through life this week, and as you're going through life, and there are some interruptions coming. Here's our choice, the first choice, whether to stop or not to stop. You decide, yes, I'm going to stop. I want to hear this need. And as I stop, I'm going to look at this person, and I'm going to see them as a child of God. And I'm going to remember, perhaps if I know them, if they're in my family, how much I love them and how much I depend upon them. And then, as that encounter continues, to be able to think of our very best selves. Selves we want to be. And to make sure our actions are consistent with those very best selves. To do this not just once, time after time, day after day, month after month, in all our encounters along the way. Let us bow in prayer. Loving God, thank you for giving us so many people that we can, if we choose,